Well, that was f***ing metal. You know, nothing's undermined the public's trust in mainstream history and archaeology quite like the legend of Atlantis.
The lost city of Atlantis was said to be the world's first advanced civilization. A powerful, rich kingdom.
Most people think of Atlantis as a very highly technologically advanced civilization.
Oh yeah, Greg Little. He's an explorer. Right. Reminds me when I used to put filmmaker on my LinkedIn profile, which, of course, when translated from the original Elvish, means unemployed.
The theories of its location range from just off the coast of Ireland
Whoa!
to the Azore Islands, 900 miles west of even Antarctica. In Nazi Germany,
Here we go.
many believe the Aryan master race were descendants of the Atlanteans.
Yeah. Well, that's true, but I already made a whole video about that. Next!
The people of Atlantis as a whole had mass reincarnated as the people of America, and that America was, in a sense, a future life carryover of Atlantis.
And cue fear-mongering about the end of the world. Now.
Even a relatively small asteroid coming in at the right angle, not necessarily hitting Earth, but sort of grazing the Earth, could theoretically change the tilt axis of the Earth significantly. Now, if that occurred, land and ocean would redistribute on the Earth.
You know, we allow this shit to be shown on TV, and then we wonder why people can't agree on objective reality anymore. What could it be? Is it Twitter? Oh!
Perhaps we are on the verge of uncovering the final piece of the puzzle that will change our understanding of Earth's history forever. But will we uncover it before it's too late?
So will ancient aliens be proven right before the Earth explodes? No.
From Plato comes the story of Atlantis, a great, advanced civilization.
Oh look, it's renowned kook Graham Hancock. His hobbies include taking powerful psychedelics, going on podcasts, and doing real, tangible harm to the public's understanding of history by misleading millions of gullible people into believing outlandish ideas. And then, when those ideas collapse under the tiniest bit of scrutiny, he complains loudly that no one's taking him seriously and that he's being silenced. This fosters anti-intellectualism, which is dangerous for democracy.
He said that Atlantis ceased to wear its prosperity with moderation. It's this hubris, this conceit of Atlantis, that it had become so sure of itself that somehow the universe struck it down. Of course, the view of historians and academics is that Plato's story is just made up. He just made it up to make some political or philosophical point. But this cannot be so. That view can't be right. I was very suspicious of that view the first time I heard it from a mainstream historian. Why are they saying that Plato made this up? Plato repeatedly states that it is a true story.
And that's the classic argument. Now, as far as we know, the story of Atlantis originates with the writings of the Greek philosopher Plato, and conspiracy theorists will insist that there's too much real-world detail for the story to be false. They say if this was meant as a fictional fable and allegory, then where are the gods? Where are the monsters? Where are the supernatural elements? Surely this is a history of real events. However, if you look at the story in the context that Plato was writing it, it was a philosophical dialogue. He meant it to prove a point. It's a work of fiction. But hey, don't take my word for it. I'm not an ancient historian. But thankfully, I know one. Dr. David Miano from the channel World of Antiquity. You know, he just made an Atlantis video debunking the main claims of that whole conspiracy theory. And I'll let him explain how we are almost 100% sure that Plato wrote Atlantis as a fictional tale. Take it away, David.
Hi, everybody. David Miano here from the World of Antiquity channel. You know, people have been fascinated by the story of Atlantis, told by the character Critias in Plato's books called the Critias and the Timaeus. At the start of the Timaeus, Socrates summarizes the institutions of the ideal state that were delineated in an earlier work of Plato, the Republic. And he says he would like to hear a story which would bring out the character of his state by representing it in a major war. This prepares us for an invented fable, a story that celebrates the great victory of ancient prehistoric Athens over the vast military might of Atlantis. So this tale is a narrative presentation of a philosophical theme. It is a myth, and myths are used quite a bit in Plato's writings. The myths in Plato's works are told by a speaker in a monologue, a narrative description intended to produce a pleasing psychological effect, and the speaker claims the story goes back to older oral sources. Plato likes to include stories that cannot be empirically verified. Their authority derives from tradition, and so they're not subject to rational examination by the audience. You might wonder why he would use myths, which are visual in nature, instead of straight-up argumentation. But that's because he wanted to appeal to a wider audience and make his philosophy more interesting. Plato, in fact, in his book, The Republic, makes the assertion that all mythology is false, that is, factually false, though still useful for teaching. We do not know the exact truth about events of the distant past, he writes. Plato doesn't believe that myth, either written or oral, can convey accurate knowledge of history. That's not what it's for. But why does Critias, the character who relays the story of Atlantis, keep repeating over and over that this story is not an invention, but an accurate historical record? There's been more than one explanation for that, but it would seem that the combination of the completely fantastical elements in the story, with Critias' claims about historicity, is a deliberate tension that Plato is using to satirize claims of this sort. But no one who once believed the tale should get down on themselves about it. Even some people in ancient times were fooled by it. I go into more detail on Plato's story of Atlantis in my companion video to this one, so please check it out over on the World of Antiquity channel.
Thank you, David. And keep doing what you're doing, corrupting the youth by teaching communism in our universities. Let's see what else Graham Hancock has to say.
So when I published Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995, it was at the end of a long lineage going back to Plato and before, and of course famously Ignatius Donnelly in the 1900s, the early 1900s.
Are you sure it was the early 1900s, Graham?
1900s and late 1800s.
There you go.
Wrote Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which was a huge investigation of Atlantis. So this subject has been tackled again and again and again.
It's funny you should mention that book, The Antediluvian World, because like Plato's relevant dialogues, I'm not entirely convinced that Graham has actually read it. But I have. And I gotta say, that book and the story of its author is way more interesting and true than anything this crackpot has got to say. Thought I'd film this next little bit of the video close to some real evidence of a catastrophic flood, namely out here on my porch. The X that's been spray painted and then painted over again on the front of my house here. This mark was made in 2005, shortly after Hurricane Katrina, by the National Guard as they were coming by and checking houses for survivors. I didn't live in this house back then. I didn't even live in the city back then. I'm a filthy transplant. And of course, as long as we're talking about Atlantis, the antediluvian world, I think it's kind of worth noting that place that I live here in New Orleans, well, it is the antediluvian world. This place will be underwater, probably before I die. But you know, before we get into that future catastrophe, let's return to the one that supposedly happened in the far distant past. The 1882 book Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by American politician and novelist Ignatius Donnelly, single-handedly kicked off the modern obsession with Atlantis and laid out a number of detailed theories that have gone on to be immensely influential in our culture. I'll dive more into Donnelly's life and career in a bit, and trust me, it's a hell of a story. But first I want to touch upon the unfortunate legacy of his ideas, and why it's important for us as historians and students of history to talk about it. The Antediluvian World casts an incredibly wide net, examining archaeology, genetics, anthropology, linguistics, you name it. And in yet another example of the human mind's amazing ability to detect patterns that aren't there, it makes the claim that not only did Atlantis exist, but it colonized most of the planet. And after its destruction in a flood about 12,000 years ago, displaced Atlanteans went on to found just about every civilization of the ancient world. Ignatius Donnelly shaped pretty much every ancient history conspiracy theory out there. For example, The Chariots of the Gods, the book that kickstarted the whole ancient aliens theory, takes many of its finer points from ones that Donnelly makes in the antediluvian world. Heinrich Himmler, too, owes Donnelly a debt of gratitude. Though Donnelly was progressive for his time in many ways, his feverish scribblings about the Atlantean origin of human races found a cozy home in the racist pseudo-history promoted by Nazi archaeology. Donnelly wrote The Antediluvian World and its spectacularly titled sequel, Ragnarok, The Age of Fire and Gravel, at the tail end of the 19th century, when the Western world was undergoing an intellectual and scientific upheaval. Modern medicine pretty much came about during this period. Electricity became an everyday part of life, and so did everything else that came with it, like telephones and the movies. But not everything was sunshine and puppies. It was the Gilded Age, after all, and wealth inequality was truly staggering. Like, we think we've got it bad now, but honestly, I think the Vanderbilts could teach Elon Musk a thing or two about extravagance. For God's sake, I mean, I've been to ancient Roman palaces that were less opulent than the robber baron mansions in Newport, Rhode Island. The turn of the 20th century was also perhaps the most intensely racist period in human history. Eugenics were widely implemented and embraced by mainstream science. European anti-Semites proposed theories of racial hygiene, and here in America, anti-miscegenation laws, designed to keep blacks and whites from intermarrying, followed the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which kicked off 5 decades of legal segregation nationwide here in the good old US of A. Of course, racial hygiene inspired those goose-stepping morons we love to hate, but unfortunately its legacy has lasted a whole lot longer than that. And one of the ways that it manifests is through ancient aliens, Atlantis, and conspiracy theories about ancient civilizations. Much is made of the racist premise of the show Ancient Aliens, and for good reason. With the possible exception of Stonehenge, it never seems to argue that aliens were responsible for ancient European achievements. But it does seem to be obsessed with proving that extraterrestrials are behind all of the African, Asian, and indigenous monuments and technologies throughout all of human history. There's a simple reason for this. Ancient Aliens is an intellectual descendant of the theory that I like to call Ancient Aryans, which basically goes like this. All the great civilizations of the ancient world were founded by expat Northern Europeans. And these empires fell because these pure Aryan supermen gave in to the temptation of race mixing, which is a disgusting idea, but more importantly, it's very obviously untrue based on mountains of genetic and archaeological evidence. All these conspiracies are symbiotic and related, whether it's Donnelly, Himmler, Hancock, or the History Channel. They may have differences in the details. They may wear different skins. Some may come in a more pleasing shape than others, but make no mistake, they're all branches of the same wacky tree. So what we're seeing is the reemergence of century-old theories, often based in social Darwinism, conveniently repackaged for the 21st century internet. These theories find the greatest traction amongst partisan crackpots, New Age screwballs, and white supremacists. People who are willing to believe one absurdity are usually willing to believe others. Like, for example, if you believe in QAnon, chances are you also believe in Bigfoot. If you believe in ancient aliens, then chances are good you believe that Robert E. Lee was a better general than Ulysses S. Grant. Boom! Roasted! What you gonna do about it, Lee? You dead bastard! But there's something else going on here. There just aren't enough fringe weirdos to account for the sheer popularity of some of these beliefs, in particular Atlantis. In a 2018 poll by Chapman University, 57% of Americans said that they believed that advanced civilizations like Atlantis existed in prehistory. This isn't just something skulking around in the dark corners of the internet. It's a full-fledged national embarrassment, a catastrophic failure of historical education. Now, Ancient Aliens and programs like it are definitely a big reason for this, and if there's any justice in the world, the producers of that show will have their day in court. But in my opinion, academia also bears a little bit of responsibility. Y'all are supposed to be the shield that guards the realms of men. You're supposed to be protecting us with good science and good history, but you've been so busy trying to impress each other that you've let the barbarians through the gates. I swear to God, some of y'all are like, oh, this ancient alien stuff is a real problem. I know, I'll write a scientific paper about it. It'll be called Pseudoscience in the Age of the Internet. An examination of ancient aliens, Atlantis, Graham Hancock, and nobody's gonna read that shit. Now I know y'all have hard jobs and not a lot of extra time, and you're not paid well, and many of you just don't even want to wade into this muck at all, and hey, fair enough. And to their credit, I mean, there are academics like David who are actually meeting people where they're at and going on social media, going on the places like YouTube where this information is spread the most effectively and combating it in a public forum with good public history. But I gotta say, it's not enough. I mean, you look on Twitter, for example, you look at the profile of a very prestigious and accomplished archaeologist, and she's got maybe 3,000 followers. And then you hop over to some bullshit artist over on YouTube whose neo-Nazi dog whistles are loud enough to shatter my dachshund's eardrums, and he's got like 200,000 subscribers. I hope you can hear this from all the way up in that ivory tower, but, us YouTubers who actually cite our sources and, do even the tiniest bit of due diligence about the information we're providing the public, we're here on the front line, and I gotta say, we are losing. Now, I know you guys have always wanted to be Indiana Jones, so want to fight some Nazis? Here's your chance. Now, just to clarify, there's this idea in a lot of crackpot circles that mainstream academia and archaeology are at best extremely narrow-minded and dogmatic, and at worst, actively covering up the truth. Now, I don't buy this at all, but I do think it raises some pretty interesting points about the scientific method and how we understand the world around us. At one point in history, we believed that the sun revolved around the Earth. We now know this to be false based on overwhelming contrary evidence. It's important to be open to new ideas, but if you open your mind too much, your brain will fall out. We don't want to become gullible or accept ideas without evidence. So how does science strike that balance? Is there a filter in place that allows good evidence-based new ideas through while still managing to keep out the bullshit? Well, to answer that question, I want to bring in my buddy here on YouTube, History with Cy, who runs a great channel full of fascinating stories about ancient history. He actually just made a video about this very topic.
Thanks, Atun-Shei. Science. These days, it's become a dirty word. There are a lot of fancy definitions out there. But when it comes down to it, science is just trying to understand the natural world around us by using facts, evidence, and reason. Archaeologists use this process to assess the validity of a hypothesis, which is an idea or assumption that can be tested. For example, one hypothesis that an archaeologist might come up with is that during the early Bronze Age, copper from mines in central Anatolia was exported further south to the people living in ancient Mesopotamia. If this was the case, then the copper found at early Bronze Age sites in Mesopotamia, whether raw or crafted into tools and objects, should have the same composition or purity as the ore from the copper mines in Anatolia. The archaeologist would then analyze samples of copper from both sites to see if they match. If they do, then the archaeologist may have increased confidence that his or her hypothesis is correct. However, if the data doesn't support the hypothesis, then the archaeologist has to think about alternative explanations and come up with a different premise that can be tested with data. This may require getting more data and excavating other sites. By weeding out less plausible hypotheses in favor of more plausible ones, the archaeologist comes closer to the truth. This is different than what Donnelly was doing when making his claims about Atlantis. Donnelly had already accepted the existence of Atlantis as fact because, well, Plato mentioned it several times in a story, and so it must be true. Donnelly wasn't testing any hypothesis or theory. For him, Atlantis' existence was not in question, and the use of various artifacts and commonalities found in many ancient cultures and mythologies of the world were used simply to further support his claims. You can see how this contrasts with the scientific method and what archaeologists do. Archaeologists start with evidence and then work towards a conclusion. Donnelly and other pseudoscientists start with a conclusion and then try to find evidence to support it.
On December 20th, 1868, Ignatius Donnelly wrote in his diary that,
I'm not one of those who believes that politics is a mere base struggle for place and plunder, where the profoundest rascality and deepest purse always win. It is so to have lived as to make someone better for your having lived.
Pretty incredible, right? That's the sort of private sincerity you can only dream of having in a politician. Donnelly wrote that near the end of his 3-term tenure in the U.S. House of Representatives, and he was nothing if not sincere. But what do politics have to do with Atlantis? Well, everything, it turns out. Donnelly was born in Philadelphia in 1831 to an Irish immigrant family. His father had abandoned Catholicism, so Ignatius was educated in a public school. When he was a teenager, he wrote poetry prolifically and kept a notebook by his bed to jot down ideas that came to him in his dreams. Donnelly's youth was a bad time to be Irish in America, especially in big cities of the East. He faced discrimination from his nativist Anglo neighbors, many of whom clung to the anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic sentiments of the Whig Party. So as Donnelly gravitated toward politics, he found natural allies in the Democrats. He entered public life on July 4th, 1855, when he gave a speech to the Democratic Party County Assembly in Philadelphia. He blasted the Whigs and the hardline know-nothings and argued that immigrants would revitalize America. The speech was a huge success. The young man soon gained the attention of John C. Breckinridge, a prominent Southern Democrat and future Vice President of the United States. The two men briefly corresponded, and Donnelly was starstruck. He was all set to be a rising star in the Democratic Party, but in an indication of both Donnelly's erratic personality and the seismic political shifts of pre-war America, 2 years later, young Ignatius would be a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. In the meantime, though, he would get married and, like many ambitious 19th century Americans, move to the frontier. Donnelly ended up on Sioux land in Minnesota in the one-horse town of Nininger City. He engaged in land speculation for a few years until he was ruined by the financial collapse of the Panic of 1857. Donnelly had helped build this agrarian community up from almost nothing. But this sudden and unfortunate economic downturn forced most of his clients in Nininger to pull up stakes and limp back east. The whole experience was incredibly disheartening. Donnelly had attempted to create, on the plains of Minnesota, the ideal Western society, where farmers and small businessmen could become prosperous simply because of the fruit of their labors, unconstrained by meddlesome Eastern capital. He came to believe that free labor was the key to creating the egalitarian utopia that was promised by the founders. And that revelation drove him into the welcoming arms of the abolitionist movement. In 1859, Donnelly wrote,
Laboring men of the old world, you are, many of you, at the foot of the ladder which all mankind are compelled to climb. You are clambering the rungs which the overthrow of the old world's aristocratic notions has left open to you. Which party will help you up? That which stands committed to the South and slavery, that which would reduce and has reduced labor to the degradation of bondage, which presents it no destiny but shame and humiliation? Or that party, which with no dark record in the past, with no principle but those which the Declaration of Independence has set forth, with equality, liberty, humanity for all men, strives by doing the inalterable justice to the black, to advance the dignity and promote the welfare of the white race.
That year, Donnelly ran for the lieutenant governorship of Minnesota alongside Alexander Ramsey, who had been the territorial governor before statehood. Buoyed by anti-slavery sentiment, the pair won in a landslide. Presiding over the state senate, Donnelly quickly gained a reputation as a fiery orator and a passionate advocate for the rights of the common man. He advocated for financial assistance for the farmers who were affected by the Panic of '57, and during the presidential election of 1860, he tirelessly campaigned for Abraham Lincoln. Donnelly was quickly making his mark, to the point where Ramsey started seeing his second-in-command as a potential rival for the governorship. So in 1862, he encouraged Donnelly to run for Congress, and to run as a Republican in the North during the Civil War basically meant you were running unopposed. That same year, Minnesota was racked by violence during the Dakota War, a vicious conflict between white settlers and the Sioux Nation. Donnelly accompanied troops out on campaign during that conflict. However, the fact that he never saw any actual combat was quietly left out of his official dispatches. Nonetheless, it increased his popularity immensely among his constituents. The election won, Donnelly moved to Washington to represent his state. Throughout most of his tenure in Congress, he staunchly backed the party line. During the war, he supported Lincoln's every decision. With Lincoln dead and the rebellion crushed, he gravitated toward the radical Republican position of a harsh, punitive Reconstruction. He also supported unconditional civil rights for blacks, and was instrumental in creating the Freedmen's Bureau, which assisted and protected newly freed slaves in the post-war South. But as the years went by, Donnelly became increasingly disillusioned with his Republican colleagues. His time in the halls of federal power had only increased his anti-elitist sentiments at a time when the party of Lincoln was climbing into bed with big business. Donnelly's break from the party raised the ire of another Midwestern Republican, Elihu Washburn of Illinois, who accused the famously anti-capitalist Donnelly of taking a cash bribe from a major railroad company, which was a total lie. The bribe wasn't cash, it was company stock. Ignatius vowed revenge and took to the floor of the sacred chamber of the U.S. House of Representatives to spew an hour-long, profanity-laced rant against Washburn, which ended like this.
If there be one character which, while blotched and spotted all over, yet raves and rants and blackguards like a prostitute, if there be one bold, bad, empty, bellowing demagogue, it is the gentleman from Illinois.
The speech backfired spectacularly. Donnelly's signature invective had served him well when he had directed it at Confederates and Democrats. Turning his vitriol on his own allies only served to alienate them, and the party didn't bother nominating him for re-election that year. So he ran as an independent instead, and split the Republican vote between himself and the party's candidate. So a Democrat wiped the floor with them both. Donnelly would never again hold federal office. Though the Republican Party was done with Donnelly, Donnelly was not done with the Republican Party. Throughout the 1870s, he tried again and again to regain political power in Minnesota, this time running on an explicitly populist independent platform. He enjoyed local popularity in his home of Dakota County and could always count on the support of the hardscrabble rural farmers in the southern part of the state, but it wasn't enough. Donnelly's particular vision of America was an agrarian utopia, defined by small insular communities, with individual liberty cherished above all. The trouble was, this vision was hopelessly out of date. Jackson and Jefferson were in the rearview mirror, their relevance receding fast. The future of populism would be Eugene Debs and Huey Long, and though Donnelly shared some ideological ground with both of those politicians, he never really had much concrete policy to back his rhetoric up. Donnelly was naive, pure and simple. The 20th century would be urban and global, an age of steel and concrete. It was inevitable. I think that Donnelly came to realize this, at least on some level, after a particularly stinging political defeat in 1878. I think he knew that his utopia would never come about. I think he knew his dream was dead. And in his mind, the only alternative was apocalypse. America had ceased to wear its prosperity with moderation, and now it would pay the price. In 1891, a biographer described this period in Donnelly's life with suitably dystopian prose.
He'd been driven out of public life by the corrupt power of money. His crops had been devoured by corporations and grasshoppers. He was covered with debts to the eyelids. Instead of taking to drink to drown his sorrows, or going out and hanging himself, as some men would have done under similar circumstances, he retired to the shades of Ninetgarten, and there, in the midst of the Arctic cold and deep snows of a very severe winter, with the sheriff or the constable banging every day or two at the door to serve a summons or an execution, he sat quietly down to recreate the history of man before the deluge. He wrote Atlantis.
The Antediluvian World was a gigantic hit, a nationwide bestseller, and Donnelly's theories took America by storm. In 1882, Atlantis was even the theme of Mardi Gras down here in New Orleans. So Donnelly wrote more books. There was the sequel, Ragnarok, which argued that Atlantean civilization had been destroyed by an immense comet 12,000 years ago. There was The Great Cryptogram, a 1,000-page screed which set about to prove that Sir Francis Bacon was the real author of the plays of Shakespeare. And then a series of novels, all of which had some pretty heavy-handed populist themes. Caesar's Column is a science fiction story, set in the far future of 1988. It's about a working-class overthrow of a brutal capitalist oligarchy. It's probably Donnelly's best-known work, besides Atlantis, and he predicted it would be the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the populist revolution. But the revolution never came. And then there's Dr. Huguet, which, oh boy, that's a piece of work. It's basically racist Freaky Friday, so the plot is a rich white Southerner switches bodies with a poor black Southerner. So the message is good. The message is, oh, well, you know, why can't we all just get along? But, of course, being written in the 1890s, it's horrifically tasteless, might be the most generous way to describe it. Now, starting in 1892, the populist movement started gaining some serious steam in the United States for the first time. And Donnelly jumped at the chance to be a part of it. He campaigned for the populist presidential candidate that year, James Weaver. Weaver did well, shockingly well for a third-party candidate, snagging 4 western states, but unsurprisingly, did not take the White House. Soon after, Donnelly's wife of 30 years passed away, and he found comfort in the arms of his 21-year-old secretary. In 1900, the populists ran him on the vice presidential ticket. That July 4th, he gave a speech in Iowa to commemorate Independence Day. He was mumbling and slurring his words. He couldn't string sentences together or finish thoughts. The audience could barely hear, much less understand him. 6 months later, he was dead. Some say Atlantis is at the bottom of the ocean. Others say it's buried beneath Antarctic ice. No. The truth is, Atlantis is in Minnesota.